Hi everyone, my name is Army of One, and today I'm going to be reviewing the 1994 album Thelected Ambient Works Volume II by Aphex Twin. Saw 2, as I will now refer to it as, is a landmark release in the ambient genre and a significant yet not altogether unexpected shift in sound for Aphex Twin, who himself is a one-of-a-kind British electronic music producer born Richard D. James in 1972. His second album, it preceded his 1992 debut Selected Ambient Works 85-92, which to this day is pretty unanimously regarded as the gold standard for the IDM genre or intelligent dance music, which originated from the UK in the late 80s and early 90s. It's a glitchy techno masterstroke with an infectious and infallible pulse, and considering he reportedly began work on the music that would comprise Saw 85 at the tender age of 13, perhaps one of the most impressive debut albums in modern music. The music then of Saw 2 was a pretty drastic departure from Saw 85, with almost all of the groovy and percussive elements stripped entirely back, leaving behind bare and elongated texture stretched out for 5, 7, 10, 11 minutes at a time, with 2 discs of runtime lasting over 2.5 hours, which you can almost bump up to 3 if you include the vinyl/cassette exclusive Stone and Focus and the 2017 digital re-release bonus track, The One Even Slower, which is an edited version of a track taken from the 2015 Aphex Twin SoundCloud dump. More on those later. With the album lasting for as long as it does, it really doesn't lend itself to casual listening, and as a side note, I think it works much better as a headphone listen as opposed to on speakers. Not because you'll never get your aux privileges back if you play any of this album around the homies, which is true, but to me Saw 2 is as much a physical experience as it is a musical one. This album is less a sound that I listen to, and more of a world that I visit, that I go to and explore. A vast, open, and barren one, and it really lends itself to solitude. This is a solo boss fight, if you will, and taking someone else into the world with you is only going to distract you from its mesmerizing qualities. These tracks have many different emotions to them, ranging from smooth, calming, and welcoming to harsh, hostile, challenging, and even frightening. You'll encounter some scary monsters on this journey, but also warm, safe, and cozy campfires, places to recover from the onslaught of aggressive noise that seems specifically engineered to put you on edge. It's certainly a roller coaster, with the feel of the album changing direction multiple times across the 2 discs, which makes first listens all the more thrilling for their inability to be predicted. When this world is unfamiliar is when it's going to be at its most effective, so, as someone who's spent a significant amount of time with this album this year, enjoy your first listens while they last. The first disc opens with Cliffs, a relatively low-key slow burn that coasts the listener into the album with an easygoing keyboard roll and a light touch of distorted vocal texture. It's definitely a voice, but no words can be discerned from how glitchy and layered it is. Actually, back up. The album technically opens with #1, as Richard actually never saw fit to give official titles to any of these tracks, save for one, instead opting for a series of 6 color-coded pie charts referring to the 6 sides of the 3 LPs in the album's liner notes and an associated image for each section of the graph. Considering this slightly aggravating approach, I'm going to refer to every track by the unofficial fan titles, which were created by a fan/Future Warp Records employee, Greg Eden, on the spot back in '94, as he was entering the album into the warp.net database and the website wouldn't accept a blank song title for cataloging purposes. The streaming version of this album currently does still use the numerical system, so I'll include a comparison in the description if you want to listen to any of the tracks that I talk about. Anyway, Cliffs makes for a really awesome opener. It's one of the most chilled out tracks on this album, and really sets a quality precedent for what's coming up later on. It's not scant either, with a not to sneeze at 7.5 minute runtime, which really manages to get you emotionally invested in the music before you've even made it into the second track. It's just so beautiful and open, and the keyboard roll that rolls on through the song, just a plinking away, it's just really calming and soothing and lowers you into the world. And not every track on Saw 2 is like this one, but the ones that are in this vein, they only get better from here, including one of my favourite tracks, Rhubarb, which is honestly just heart-wrenchingly beautiful. It's another 7-minute titan, but with a breathtakingly soft and lush backdrop synth that elevates in intensity over the course of the track, with a relatively high-pitched tone version breaking through towards the end. It's staggering in its peacefulness and makes any lo-fi hip-hop beat to study or relax to look like heavy metal in comparison. It's that soothing. This song by itself is reason enough to listen to the album. Another beautiful highlight from the album comes much later into the second disc, titled Lichen, which is almost like a mournful ballad of strings and woodwinds. The song almost sounds like it's crying out in sadness. It's completely enthralling in how emotional it manages to be with no human vocal to be found. But like I mentioned earlier, what gives Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 its greatest strength is its elasticity, and how it is always morphing from one sound and feel to another. And for every heartstring-tugging beauty, there are just as many tracks that exist to make your blood pump, your heart rate increase, to make you look over your shoulder for an unseen monster as you wander this barren void. Take the following track Spots, for instance, which is 7 minutes of tortured reverb and echoing, distant intercom voices on loop that sounds like the score to an apocalypse movie, or maybe an abandoned mall that can sense your presence and it doesn't like it. Or maybe an earlier track like Hankie, which immediately precedes Rhubarb and stretches the string section to its absolute limit. The tree scratches around you in every direction, bouncing off the walls, refusing to stop penetrating your skull, even as you lay out down in the fetal position with your arms wrapped around your head, shaking and crying. It's eerily sinister, and while it might not sound appealing from my description, it's simply another monster encounter in the world that this album envelops you in, and without moments like this, the much less hostile moments would have no meaning. The following Grass is similar in sound, but it's much less powerful in its attempt to overwhelm you. And remember, most of these tracks are of significant length. You can basically assume every track that I mention here is 6 to 9 minutes long, with a few exceptions that I'll of course point out. But when every track grabs hold of you for this length of time and doesn't let go, it makes the metaphorical empty corridors you find yourself walking down that much longer, and gives you more room to zoom into details, to notice minute obscurities, and more time for your imagination to conjure up its own alien horrors that could be lurking unseen in these vacant hallways. Tense is definitely the word I would use to describe moments like this, and there's many more of them on Saw 2, including but not limited to tree, curtains, domino, parallel stripes, and especially grey stripe, which is so devoid of life and any form of matter that the only place that this thing could soundtrack is the nowhere dimension from that SpongeBob episode where Squidward ended up alone. This album could actually be summed up pretty accurately as an auditorial interpretation of that place. Hexagon later on in the album is actually one of the very few tracks to have traditional percussion or rhythm. The drums have this electronic tilt to them that really makes them stand out, and the synths, strained keyboard, and what sounds like a sped up click track whirring away in the background really add together for the most layered and satisfying 6 minutes of the album. Weathered Stone from Disc 1 is another track that has a bit of oomph to it, with a punchy bass line, rattling percussion that just like snaps on both sides of your head, and a very snazzy synth line that gets flavoured up with some fun keyboards on top. It's definitely a breath of fresh air after the full half hour of tension that comes before it in the midsection of the first disc. It's straight back into the void afterwards though, with Tree and Domino, which together form an 18-minute passage of spooky and dark synth, ominous keyboard, labyrinthine passages of endless nothing that finally release you into the final track of Disc 1, White Blur 1, a much shorter piece of 2 minutes 40 that consists almost entirely of wind chimes, kind of half rhythmically swaying in the first cool breeze you've felt on your skin since you entered the world of Saw 2. It really helps release the tension and add a human element to this deserted wasteland, especially considering the half-intelligible human voices drifting aimlessly in and out of the background and foreground, and it lowers you nice and gently into the start of the second disc, which opens with the only track on this album to bear an official title, Blue Calx. Blue Calx is the second installment in Richard's Calx series, preceding Green Calx from Saw 85, and preceding Yellow Calx from 1996's The Richard D. James album, and Red Calx, which eventually found its way online alongside many other tracks in the 2015 SoundCloud dump. Blue Calx is another calming first track on Saw 2 and serves a similar purpose that Cliffs does with Disc 1, but I'd argue that Blue Calx actually bears the most resemblance to Saw 85 than any other track here, with a steady drum rhythm and an open, spacey atmosphere that expands around you rather than closes in on you. Following this track we have Parallel Stripes, which is another ambient, empty chasm of solitude, which contrasts quite strongly against what comes after, which is the pummeling shiny metal rods, a relative cacophony compared to the rest of the album. Walls of distorted noise barrel forward with a hulking, lumbering repetition, a real boulder that chases you for 5.5 minutes until you reach the relative safety of the aforementioned and completely bare grey stripe. This track is basically a 5-minute long echo, with a quiet synth bubbling away quietly underneath you before it spirals up into the sky and out of sight, possibly stretching the word alone across it in multiple different fonts as it goes. But if you make it to the end of this track and admit that you actually miss SpongeBob, you'll be rewarded with the absolutely delightful Z-Twig, a brief but buoyant ray of sunshine that does absolute wonders to calm the nerves, which have been stretched razor thin at this point after the comparative punishment that the second disc opens with. Z-Twig is a vibrant keyboard number that really feels like an oasis oasis in the middle of an empty desert, but with only 2 minutes to enjoy it, who knows if it was ever really there. It's already in the past now, and Windowsill has already sucked you in with a haunting woodwind and a shrill, piercing note that whips through the track like wind without warning. This track doesn't feel like it's out to get you like a Shiny Metal Rods does, but you're definitely along for an uncomfortable ride with this one, like being stuck in a whirlwind of uncanny sound. I want to talk about the end of the album because the way that Saw 2 allows you exit is to me one of its strongest appeals. The album throws you another moment of respite at this point with the aforementioned Hexagon and Lichen back to back, two of my favourite songs here, but after this point the gas is pressed right to the floor until the very end. This section of the album is easily the most depraved and dark and menacing, and it's one hell of a 27-minute gauntlet to make it through the consecutive run of Spots, Tassels, and the almost unbelievable White Blur 2. I mentioned Spots earlier. Tassels is perhaps the most claustrophobic track here, with angry electronic synths swirling around you like a constricting snake, and a sorrowful repeating horn line that goes on that seems to signal your own demise, at least until it descends in pitch to bear more resemblance to a horror movie soundtrack than anything else. And on that happy note, we arrive at the penultimate, longest, and in my opinion, the single most annoying track on Saw 2, White Blur 2. I know this is the first negative thing that I have to say about this album, but White Blur 2 is the only track here that manages to feel like a slog. Don't get me wrong, it absolutely has a place in the track list, and as the final boss of this open world of exploration, it does do a good job, but 11.5 minutes is just overkill. It's already the most repetitive song in the track listing with a dour keyboard loop droning on, and on, and on, over, and over, and over again. The only thing to break up the monotony of this line that goes on is the frankly unnerving sample of what sounds like a child giggling. This track knows how punishing it is, and it's laughing at you while you sit through it for what feels like an eternity. It's without doubt the most challenging stretch on Saw 2, and will absolutely test your patience, but since I'm a sucker for delayed gratification myself, I still ride it out to the end every time I listen to the album. It's not unbearable. It can just get boring after going on for so long, and it feels like a significant percentage of the album you spend in this song, and every time you get back to it again, you're just like, oh, this one again, I'm gonna have to wait 11 minutes. But what really makes it worth sitting through is the climax of this album, and I think Richard picked the perfect outro to allow us exit from his desolate realm. Matchsticks is the closing track of Disc 2 and is possibly my favourite song here. The payoff for making it through to this moment makes every second of the last 2.5 hours worth it, in my opinion. It's no less empty, it's no less barren, but the swelling chords and the vast space it creates around you makes it feel like you've been through hell and come out the other side to a safe haven where nothing can touch you, nothing can harm you, and you've survived what many possibly might not have. I can't understate this relief that this song fills me with, how powerfully it releases 2 hours of tension, and what it feels like to make it through this journey with my sanity still intact, which I would definitely be frightened for if I really did find myself in the places in my mind that this album creates. Despite how calming it is, you're still completely alone. It's eerie, there's nobody here, and maybe there never was anybody here. It reminds me of an empty multiplayer lobby in a long-dead video game, actually, formerly full of life, youth, and excitement, but since abandoned, a now liminal space where to visit is to only find emptiness. It's not liminal in the sense of something like the backrooms where unseen horrors lurk around every corner. That's a more apt description for the rest of the album. But on this one, it's just the lobby, a Resident Evil safe room, a place where safety is guaranteed. It's a phenomenal closer, and every time I put on Saw 2 and prepare myself for the 2.5 hour journey, Matchsticks is my destination. That covers basically every track on the streaming version, but if you do a little online digging, you can uncover another 20 minutes of extra material that accompany this album. Bumping the runtime up to 2 hours, 57 minutes, and 56 seconds, Stone and Focus is a 10-minute track exclusive to the vinyl, cassette, and 2017 digital re-release of the album due to the CD time constraints. And the 11-minute bonus cut, The One Even Slower, is tacked onto the end of the 2017 digital re-release as well on Aphex Twin's website. Stone and Focus was also released on an obscure electronic compilation called Excursions and Ambience later in 1994, making it available in the digital space, and it has since become a fan favourite of the Aphex Twin community, with over 8 million YouTube views on an unofficial upload, and I think for good reason. It's a transcendent and meditative piece that is as peaceful and soothing as anything else on Saw 2, and I highly recommend seeking it out. It lands between Windowsill and Hexagon on the expanded track list, which significantly widens the window of respite on the second disc, and it gives you much more courage and space to breathe before diving headfirst into the whirlpool that is Disc 2's ending. And while I do like The One Even Slower, Replacing Matchsticks as the final track is honestly not my favourite decision. I understand it's a bonus song included 23 years after the album was released, and right at the very end is where bonus songs usually get put, but this track is more hostile, less gentle than the original closer, and that sense of homeliness and relief that I feel at the end of the album just gets thrown into uncertainty again, making the ending feel much more like a cliffhanger than a definitive closer. Aphex Twin is usually not really capable of making bad songs, and this is of course no exception to that rule. It's an atmospheric, moody, and slightly sinister ambient cut, but I feel like the original closer makes for a much more satisfying ending. I certainly recommend trying it, but it's not as essential to me as a Stone and Focus is, which does wonders to enhance the pacing of the second disc. I don't know if you could tell, but I love Saw 2. As a hip-hop fan, I definitely didn't see a 3-hour double-disc ambient record cracking into and basically overtaking my entire rotation in 2023. But when I found myself enveloped in the world that this album creates, I can honestly say that I didn't want to leave. It's not an album that I can put on in the background and listen to while I do other tasks. It's an album that I put at the forefront of my attention, a place that I go to and I stay zoned into with my attention locked in place as I autopilot those other tasks in the real world. It's kind of a reversal of putting music on in the background. The tasks are in the background now. It's certainly a strange allure that Saw 2 has on me, but I can't deny the beautiful textures, the mastery of tension, and the absolute vastness of the music. The amount it achieves with how little it uses is staggering, and the fact that this came out in 1994 demonstrates how far ahead of its time this album was. This album feels entirely and completely digital, and the isolation it creates feels like something only very modern technology could achieve. But this album predates Windows 95, man. I can barely imagine how potent this music was back then, but don't think that means it has no potency now, because I can't name a single other album that does what this album does and sounds like how this album sounds. It's a genuine, one-of-a-kind album that has worked as a brilliant stepping stone into the world of ambient music for me. And even though I'm still very new to this genre, I've already found multiple other albums in this lane that I really enjoy. The only reason I can't give it a perfect score is because of White Blur 2, which is a shame, but I still have no qualms with giving it a score like this. A genuine classic. My name is Army of One. If I don't like an album, that's my loss, not yours, and thank you so much for watching. Last tape was all ambition, but this one I got a vision. 6 a.m.